It's my privilege to introduce our esteemed speakers of this session. Our first speaker is Professor Manisha Choudhary. Professor Manisha Choudhary teaches at the Department of History, University of Delhi. She specializes in the history of pre-colonial India and Rajasthan. She completed her bachelor's degree from Miranda House and pursued her MPhil and PhD at the University of Delhi. Her research on Banjara community and their social and economic contributions in pre-colonial states is explored in her book Trade, Transport and Tanda, Shifting Identities of the Banjaras. She has also published Delhi, A Concise History. She is also the recipient of the Professor Pema Ram Award for Best Paper at the Rajasthan History Congress and was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. Recently, she compiled the history of the University of Delhi in the book, The University of Delhi, a comprehensive account of its resilience, knowledge, leadership, and growth. May I request Professor Manisha Choudhary ma'am to come up on the stage? Thank you, ma'am. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Prakash Singh. Dr. Prakash Singh is a writer, cultural theorist, and an assistant professor of theory of theatre and performance studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Choudhary Nehru University. He is the author of critically acclaimed book, Cultural Labour, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and Body on the Barricades, Life, Art and Resistance in Contemporary India, published by Left Word Books in 2023. He has also published in various research journals, including Asian Theatre Journal, Performance Research, Theatre Research International, and Economic and Political Weekly. His forthcoming book, Skeptical State, will be published by HarperCollins. I request Sir to kindly come up on the stage. Our final speaker will be Dr. Benil Biswas, an aesthete, performer, scholar, and cultural commentator who has been part of the campus theatre in both Kolkata and Delhi for more than 2 decades. He is currently an assistant professor and program coordinator of the MA Performance Studies program at the School of Culture and Creative Expressions, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. Initially trained as a scholar of literature in English, he later pursued his MPhil and PhD in Theatre and Performance Studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His research interests include cultural studies, performance theory, decoloniality, and aesthetics from a minoritarian perspective, especially caste. He has been invited to lecture at several institutions, including the National School of Drama, and in 2016 attended the Mellon School of Theatre and Performance Research at Harvard University. I request Sir to kindly come up on the stage. Thank you, sir. I would now like to request Dr. Kumkum Srivastava to proceed with the session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I have been partially introduced. I'm a historical anthropologist. My work has been on the anthropology of performance. And my first lecture on the anthropology of performance was delivered in Kolkata at Professor Srivastava, my late husband's memorial event, where I spoke of anthropology of performance, teacher as performer. My other lecture on anthropology of performance was a case study of Qawwali. In fact, it is the lecture on which we had delivered many years ago. All these lectures have been compiled into a book called Qawwali, Call from the Heart of Love. So this book also has a chapter on the anthropology of performance, a case study of Qawwali. So I'm going to talk about the embodied past, how anthropology, I'm going to introduce this topic in a different tone altogether, how anthropology views embodied pasts, memory, and performance. So anthropology views embodied pasts as cultural histories, inscribed in the body through repetitive practices, where memory is not just cognitive, but somatic, activated via performance. This triad, body, recall, and enactment, forms a dynamic framework for understanding how societies preserve and transmit identity. Now, the core concepts of this theme, embodied pasts, memory, and performance. Here, embodied pasts I understand to mean history stored in bodily habits, gestures, and sensory schemas. Past experiences shape present physically or present physicality, generational dances, encoding migration stories. Now, memory has a dual form: communicative, that is oral and lived, and cultural, ritualized, object-mediated. Bodily memory overcomes sometimes textual via kinesthetic recall. Regarding performance, enactment of culture as restored behavior, rituals, drama, revive past somatically, bridging individual bodies to collective heritage. Now, the key theoretical foundations of the anthropology of performance, there are 4 phases: breach, crisis, redress, which is performance, and reintegration. This is Victor Turner's thesis. I mean, he's written extensively on anthropology of performance, and he believes that liminality suspends norms, body undergoes symbolic ordeals, embodying communal memory. Paul Connaughton has also spoken extensively on social memory, where he says incorporative practices, gestures, parades inscribe past in the muscles of the body. He talks about commemorative ceremonies as bodily memories, marching rhythms, recall battles. And Thomas Sodas's paradigm, when he talks about embodiment paradigm, he sees the body as pre-objective site of culture, past felt sensorially before being symbolized. He also, in fact, brings Sufi, I have used this thesis in studying healing at Sufi shrines. He talks about healing rituals which revive trauma while tactile reenactment. Pierre Bourdieu, as you all know, concept of habitus. He talks about durable dispositions which carry class, cultural pasts in posture and in taste. He also talks about bodily hexes, which means the elite gait, how you walk. In fact, he studied the walks of various noblemen. He talks about how elite walk differently from a laborer, where he studied, and he says that this elite gait performs sedimented history unconsciously. Clifford Geertz, has talked about, studied Indonesia, where he talks about cockfights as performances layered with historical meaning. And he has used the example of cockfights, which embody feuds from colonial pasts. Richard Schechner's performance theory explains ritual efficacy through synchronized embodiment. He talks about twice behaved actions which store memory. Jan Espens, of course, talks about cultural memory, institutionalized via figures of memory rituals, protest sites, protest rallies, he talks about streets and how these sites, at these sites, the body actualizes these sites. And he's studied especially memorial sites and sites of protest. Now here what is the interconnection between body, between memory and performance? So body is an archive. Pasts embodied in habitus. Performance retrieves via repetition, which is Connaughton's view. Performance activates memory. Liminal acts disrupts habitus, reenacting history, which is Turner's. And memory shapes embodiment, the cultural schemas, gender norms, learned somatically, performed daily, which are the views of Butler and Bourdieu. So this is a cyclical process. Past leads to embodied habit, which is reflected in performance, and it refreshes the memory. So how is the past transmitted? Bodily techniques. Moss talks about learned gestures. Like in Japan, you bow. The process, there used to be kowtow earlier, and he says that learned gestures like bowing, like clapping, carry ancestral wisdom. Then the other way is by somatic mnemonics, rhythm, pain, trance, lodge events in the flesh. Scarification recalls initiations. Then liminal transformations, the rites of passage. They strip, rebuild body, imprinting new historical layers. What is hybriding? People who are, the dancers, they use bhav. Colonial past embodied in mimicry performances, subverting power. Now, in India, the examples that I have collected are the Ram Leela. Actors embody Ramayan figures, processions kinesthetically, and recall the epic dharma. Sufi whirling, the whirling dervishes, the dance, Rumi's dance of the whirling dervishes. I have studied it extensively. My work is on Rumi. So dervishes spin for a different reason. They spin to dissolve ego, embodying prophetic memory. The Nedembo rituals in Africa, the neophytes' ordeals somatize mythic origins. The Jewish Seder gestures, bitter herbs, reclining, performs exodus trauma, and Aboriginal Corroboree dances map songlines, bodies as living maps of creation pasts. In fact, in Mexico, the costumed parades that you might have seen embody ancestral return. They believe that the ancestors are coming back, so this is a ritual in which they celebrate the coming or the return of the ancestors. So this, but in fact in Europe, the over-focus is on only theatrical performances, and it ignores non-representational trances. And sometimes the power oversights, habitus embeds inequality, performances can reinforce oppression. This is the negative side. And in this digital era, virtual embodiment, VR rituals extend somatic memory beyond the flesh. Trauma applications, somatic therapy, revives suppressed past via bodily cues. So this, I've explained the concept according to the anthropology. So this framework reveals culture as kinetic heritage, pasts not remembered but re-performed through living bodies. And now I request Manisha, my first panelist, and there were many questions which I have written. How do we move beyond the idea of memory as solely an archival material record to include the body as a primary site of remembering? And so this is a question for her, and she's going to include this and answer this in her submission. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for this very intriguing introduction to the session and the panel. Thank you everyone for being here, and thanks for Heritage Association of Department of History Janki Devi Memorial for considering me for this session. To talk about the theme that we have taken here, which talks about performances, memory and history. So far the works that I have seen, or the works that I have done in terms of history, I have always tried to relate and see how far the memory plays a role in this, because my exposure actually started with history only by working on, initially at a stage, on tribes, which is considered as a tribe, but of course I don't consider Banjaras as a tribe because there's no certain parameter in which people define it. The impression with most of the people was that the Banjaras are Hindus, so their rituals are Hindu, and when they are explaining them in terms of their social organization, they've always been talking that, okay, the Banjaras do this and that, they worship something called Shiva Bhaiya, they worship the bullock and things like that. But the problem with these communities, the ones who are nomadic per se in their performances, or you can say in their day-to-day living, is that they don't maintain the record. So of course there is no view which comes as an insider's view, which is a very, very prominent theme in the history. So when there is no insider's view, how the memory plays a role, and how people who have been recording about these people from a distance, they try to explain them and define them in their records. To just give you a few glimpses here and there, I would say in the first case, the Banjaras, as they come to us from imperial record, is coming from Alauddin Khilji's work, Alauddin Khilji's time, where Ziauddin Barni says there's something called the Karwanis, and they are the ones who travel like this and that, and he has employed these people to carry everything down to Delhi because he's trying to do something called the market reforms. He is definitely somebody who is not impressed with these market reforms, who is criticizing them. Of course, not while Alauddin Khilji was alive, definitely after his death, because criticizing the king who is right now in the throne would have been very difficult, and then maintaining your patronage with him would again be a very difficult thing to do. So naturally he is complaining about these things because he says, somehow uncivilized people now enter the city, and there is an interaction that begins with them. And there's a strange class of people called Dalal who have emerged in this, right? So there are many people who are very happy with the surname Dalal, so I keep on telling them, you need to reflect, go back to Ziauddin Barni and start thinking about this surname. So this is how, we see that there is a memory which comes from Ziauddin Barni. It is the time when he is writing, and there is a distant time when he is writing after this interaction and the revised market reforms. Then this community is again defined sometime in Tariq-e-Firozshahi again during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, where they briefly mention that there is something called the people who travel with bullocks. That's it. Now from the records that are coming from the travelers, we see there's a lot of description. And we see for Peter Mundy, who is writing in 1634-65, right, the travel accounts of Peter Mundy, he has been in an Indian landscape for a very long time. He is somebody who is traveling from South India to North, which is coming down to Agra. And we all know the time frame is something when Shah Jahan is already enthroned. So this is the time when he is, narrating about these people and saying they look like this, they wear like that. And there is a baseline on which he is explaining them. But he says, I did not get close to them. I am writing from the description that I am trying to pick also from various others who have been the predecessors. So there is a memory which definitely plays a role, and the performance comes in because you want the performance to be powerful. Just to give you an example again, that how things make history and how they stay with you. I'm sure everyone remembers the teacher who taught them when they were going to the preschool or initial schooling, or the teacher who was most well dressed, the teacher who was most, caring, or the teacher who has actually made the lessons very, very approachable, right? So you remember only 3 kinds of teachers. Rest, everyone comes and goes in between. So that is what memory accepts. It accepts, of course, the acceptance and rejection is again very personal. What is your experience, what is lacking, or what you are overwhelmed with is something that you would like to take into your memory or your repository, and then you would like to shun away the rest. Now that forms an archives for you. The moment you become something like that, you try to imitate, because the performance has been very, very significant at the time when the teacher was appearing for a class. So these kind of impressions which come to us through performances, definitely the history comes in much later. Like there have been many, many scholars, like we are sitting in C.D. Deshmukh auditorium. I don't know how many of us know that what kind of, memory this man used to hold. We all remember him, I'm sure some of you remember him as the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. Some remember him as Finance Minister of India. Some might know a part of him that he was a teacher, and some might know he was somebody who was a good ambassador or things like that. But this entire enactment of this personality was something that was shaped long back when he was working in his domain areas, or you can say he was working in the area of Karnataka, right? His entire understanding as a Vice Chancellor to educate the girls, because this is the time when Delhi University for the first time, the number of the girl student has, gone beyond 50%. That was the first time, right? And before that also many of them have tried to do it, but they could not achieve it. But from where he has gained it, because he had a mother who was highly, highly educated and somebody who was trying to give in, and the influence of the mother as an educator or as a woman as an educator was something that he has felt. And we see there is an immense sanctions that come to him in the name that why you are trying to open so many women colleges. And he's somebody who is still pushing forward and saying, no, you need women colleges. And therefore I'm sure you guys all see that there are hardly co-ed colleges in DU, but there are multiple which have, a W in the box next to them. So women colleges, the number has increased. So there is a memory of past which he has performed in the form of bringing women forward, and then it has created a history which comes to us through a thorough history class, or you can say through history records. Besides it, if I again go back and see body as an archives, which my ma'am has just highlighted the kind of question that I'm supposed to take up while I speak on this. Body as an archives is definitely something that you take while with your experiences, definitely. The kind of experiences we experience all through our tenure of learning, or we can say of working, is something that stays with us as an experience. Every human gets shaped with their experiences. Seasoning, or you can say conditioning, can shape you for a while, but after that, of course, it stays with you. But experiences change and alter them. And when these change, we see it is something that reflects in your performances, and these performances, be it artistic, and you all know, if we go to some dance, performance, or we go to a music recitation, or we go to watch a theater, right? A very powerful performance is something that we remember. And the rest, you might be somebody who is addicted to dramatics, but you will only remember the plays which were really, really powerful in conveying the messages, or those who were very powerful in terms of decoding the messages or criticizing or reinterpreting the existing knowledge systems. So in history, definitely memory is something which is very, very important. So now how we relate the memory to the people, as I introduced in the very beginning, is the nomadic people who have been defined as somebody who don't have a record of their own. Now their history is something that comes to us from very distant sources. The distant sources are, why I call those sources as distant sources, because none of them is actually interacting with them, they all are dealing with them in a great distance. Banjaras are interacting with the people of the state only on fringes, or only when the state is pushing or the state is pushed out of the economic system. Just to give you another example, we see the Jaipur state who is constantly aspiring to get the Banjaras in the 18th century, because there is a lot of salt production which is there, and they want to disperse this salt out of Jaipur, because Jaipur has just come up, right, 1707, after the fall of the Mughal Empire, death of Aurangzeb, the things have changed, and Jai Singh is somebody who has gone back to Amer and is trying to revive, but he realizes there's no potential of economy in terms of Amer itself, because it's a hill, it's a small area. If he tries to make a market, of course he has to do away with the royal palaces, and if he is doing with the royal palace, then of course he has to do away with the market or something or the other. So he needs a good stretch out area. So we see the project which he has taken up immediately on becoming a king is the construction of the Jaipur city, and the various structures of the Jaipur city is something that he started making in 1708 after the battle of 1707, battle of Ramgarh, and we see from there he has stretched until his death, which is 1734. He is constantly going into this making of the city. So the temple of Govind Dev Ji, then the connecting of the temple of Galta Ji, then connecting it back to the Sitla Mata, then connecting it back to the Javari, and then again connecting to the people who are left out and things like that. So we see there are multiple activities which he is doing, but he is always very conscious of something called performance. And for these performances, somebody who is trying to bring in again the memory that he has taken from the Mughal India as the performance, that how powerful the procession was of the emperor is something has defined the course of the city for the entire year, right? So the annual processions of the king around Nowruz or other festivals were something which were very, very potent acts of performance. So he brings in that memory, he tries to organize his processions in the same way, but definitely he is not somebody who is going to celebrate the Nowruz. He is someone who is not going to celebrate it. So he organizes something called a Mahayagya, right? And this Mahayagya is how it will become powerful. It will become powerful only when 1 lakh Brahmins will come for the feast, right? So this kind of, you can say the effort that you try to put in, right? The city which has just come up, that is one. How would you get, there is no population around this area because it's a dry area. How would you are going to get 1 lakh Brahmins? If 1 lakh Brahmins are coming for the feast, you need at least other people to serve them, right? You are going to organize a Havan, then of course you need people who see this, right? You need to visualize it. And then he is doing everything at a crossroad, right? Because the impression has to go down to the city as the king is there, right? Why all this is required? Because there is something, the questions of legitimacy, which is very, very essential. Without legitimacy, in terms of royalty, when people don't accept you, your own people don't relate with you, don't recognize you, who is Jai Singh, then you are somebody who is supposed to perform. And this performance is something which you try to do at such a point of time, in that kind of space, where it actually brings effect in the memory of people saying, yes, Jai Singh was great. Yes, he is someone who can be trusted. Because doing all this, the purpose is not that just to do the Havan and do the ritual, but the idea is this is going to help him to get in the traders who will come and establish the Jaipur city. And we see after this performance, which was really a good kind of show, we see that the Jain traders are coming in from Gujarat. Many of the Delhi Chandni Chowk traders, after the loss of the Delhi, they have also moved down to Jaipur, and there are multiple people who have come in even from the areas of Sindh. So this kind of composition, in order to attain a city which is cosmopolitan in nature, and secondly a city which is performing in terms of economy, because your capital or your state makes no sense unless you have resources of economy. So how essential it was for him to start from a scratch. His initial is the royalty has to be something which is recognized, and the legitimacy of the same needs to be coming from the people who are at the bottom, right? So instilling loyalty right? So royalty is something which shows itself, but the purpose is to instill loyalty amongst the locals, that yes, even after the doing away of the Mughal Empire, I am somebody whom you can trust, right? The trust within the community of, yes, he will provide me protection, yes, he will give me surety, security, he is a king who can be trusted, then these people will participate in the state, otherwise they are not, right? Because you can get the traders, but as far as the local regular things are supposed to be done in the court, or you can say in the household or other places, you need locals to participate, because they need to be, you know, people who are engaging in local, because you need to create resources for them. And then finally, that brings in the legitimacy of the king. That is how the body becomes an archive, and we see the Jaipur court is something which is a great stage in the 18th century. Like we see multiple kind of, receptions that are done to the people. That might be, if Swati ma'am is coming, then I'll go to the gate of IIC to receive her. If say Kanchan is coming, I will receive her here. And if someone else is coming, I'll just tell them, please follow me on the stage, and I'll do a bagalgiri. And if somebody is where I need to show that, this is my friend, then I'll offer a bida pan. And if I need to show that we are somebody who are embodied into each other, then that embodiment is something that will show by applying the perfume on each other there, right? This all display, this all performance has to go into the court. People need to receive and learn that the king is close to whom, and why he is close is definitely will come up in the performances of the processions that the king will take out either on Tej or Diwali or Holi or Raksha Bandhan. Those are prominent, festivals on which he will perform these things and will show that who goes along with him when he's out for the procession, along with him on the elephant, right? So there are multiple layers in this, and these are enacted at every space, right? So this is how I believe the archives comes in embodiment.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So please speak about your topic, and then I'll ask you questions later.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this session, and I was really quite fascinated after hearing that chair who has very kinds of concise notes on performance, and that was almost you are visiting your notes, so that was quite a reminder, and also Manisha for taking us to another kinds of ground of performance. But also in morning session we had a keynote by my professor Mala Sarkar, who also was a teacher and also brought me to this kinds of debates, discussions around performance studies. So what I'm going to do, we have very less time. I will do some kinds of, because this is I am aware that I'm speaking with historians, so I will try to make some connection with the history and how that some connections comes in my own kinds of writing and research. So one part, very small section that I'm going to present here is about from my book Cultural Labor, where I discuss about a cult figure. So I think most of you have seen Ghost. How many of you have seen Ghost? Not really. Okay. So yeah, some of you have seen. So basically, in so when I'm going to talk about Choudhary, then Choudhary in historical records, and this is done by Ram Garib Chaudhary, he appears as a ghost figure in parts of Bihar, and Choudhary is considered one of the cult figure coming from Dalit communities, Dusad communities in Bihar, who has multiple narratives around him, around this figure. So when Ram Garib Chaudhary records this figure, then he records as a kind of a spirit or ghost who is going to destroy the harvest of upper caste in some kinds of revenge or some kinds of taking some kinds of resistance, and that becomes the figure that gets recorded in Ram Garib Chaudhary's account. But then later, and also in some kinds of dialogue with Ram Garib Chaudhary, you have records by Gerson, and who did remarkable kinds of archiving in parts of Bihar, and then this figure is getting recorded as a first thief. Many times when you think about history of Dusad communities in Bihar, then they get also some kinds of associated with this this whole idea of the social banditry on that kinds of idea, and therefore he records as a Choudhary as a first thief. पहला चोर की तरह से उसको पेश किया जाता है. And then the figure travels. So I'm saying that how different historical point at a different historical junctures, this figure is getting recorded in a different ways in history. Then Communist Party movement becomes, communist movement becomes very, very strong in Bihar around 60s, 70s, and then suddenly Choudhary appears as a communist hero. He is now becoming part of the slogan. So Communist Party is trying to project him as a communist hero. And that becomes Choudhary suddenly becoming from host to a spirit to now you have kinds of thief. He is becoming a communist hero who is going to participate in resistance, who is going to participate in revolution. And then the juncture also came where suddenly Bihar was very much, some of those districts came under Maoist movement. And then Maoists started projecting Choudhary as some kinds of Maoist hero. And now, so it was not Marx Mao Jindabad, it was Choudhary Baba Ki Jai. That was the movement slogan in parts of Bihar. So Choudhary was the, Choudhary, Dina Bhatri, these figures were the mobilizer in real sense, in a very palpable sense, when people were giving slogans, when people were participating in the movement, and then the figure is becoming Maoist figure as a part of some kinds of projection. But you also have pamphlets, you also have some kinds of reports where they are making some kinds of claim that why Choudhary should be considered as a Maoist hero, communist hero, and those stories. Now, so suddenly you have then a story moves on, and then you have backward caste movements in Bihar. Lalu Prasad Yadav is taking the lead. He is going to Bihar to that birth sites of Choudhary, and he is saying that Choudhary was the first backward hero. And not necessarily all the kings comes from the womb of the queen, they also comes from the backward communities, and Choudhary is becoming backward hero. And again, there is a whole social movement, and that is trying to project Choudhary as some kinds of backward class hero. But then they Lalu Prasad Yadav and those backward caste politics could not sustain that figure, and later Choudhary is also becoming a Dusad hero. So Choudhary is ultimately coming to the Dusad community, identity figuration, and then Ram Vilas Paswan is taking the lead. Ram Vilas Paswan taking the lead, and he is projecting Choudhary as a real Dusad hero, real Dalit hero, and real Dalit leader. So this is the one story that I am trying to tell you, that how in a different moments of history, with the different kinds of movement, histories are getting shaped, reshaped with some kinds of memories, with different kinds of reenactment that is happening here. Another point, so one is happening through some kinds of historical junctures or historical markers. Another point, that if you go to many parts, those parts where Choudhary is considered as a cult figure, then you have different spaces where Choudhary moves. So when you are going to household kinds of spaces, then Choudhary becomes a grotesque figure. He is many times represented as a without neck. He is appearing with full of blood, neck, and the story goes that because he married to a upper caste girl, and therefore both were killed. So a typical story coming from very feudal caste background. And then, so Choudhary will be appeared many songs, especially in women's songs. Choudhary is coming as a love hero, but also as a kind of grotesque figure, very grotesque figure, who is appearing without neck in that kind of form. And then you will find that community in very internal kinds of space, or that kinds of domestic space, they are still maintaining that kinds of connections where Choudhary will appear as a grotesque figure, more intimate kinds of hero. But the same communities, when they do theatre, proper public theatre, then they try to Choudhary in a different way. They will say Choudhary is Rama Avtari, Choudhary Ram ka avatar hai. उसके अलावा, so one Brahm was very beautiful, and next Choudhary is very beautiful. So suddenly, how the communities in a same time, same time, is trying to maintain two different kinds of identity. In household, they are still trying to project grotesque identity. One, when they are coming to intra-community spaces, where other caste people are also going to come to see your theatre, then you are trying to say that Choudhary is beautiful, most beautiful hero. They are almost like Rama, or they are almost like a masculine like him. So that becomes a kind of trajectory. Now what we learn through these stories. So these are my stories. One is unfolding in historical time with some kinds of movement. One is happening in a very same time, but different kinds of through the different kinds of spaces. And I think many times when we read history, then, and I think so. One that when I'm saying Choudhary existed as a spirit figure, ghost figure, then you still have some community or some kinds of belief that is still existing there. So still a community will believe that if you are going to do something to this community, then Choudhary may appear as a ghost figure. So that is still have some kinds of palpable ground. Same way that resistance association with Choudhary still remains very live. So still I'm hoping if you hope that if some movement is going to come, then Choudhary can take a different kinds of dimension, and he can still emerge as some kinds of hero or other kinds of hero. So how one that we are reading through historical kinds of lens where they are getting marked through the history, through the movements, but they are all remains on the ground, very much viable, very much like mobilized on the ground. It depends that which memory is going to get activated in what point of time. And I think that becomes one lens through which we can think about history and that kinds of connections. So a second question comes that why the same community is maintaining two different kinds of identity. Like, you are saying that Choudhary is like a person who was killed, who still maintains very kinds of grotesque figure, but other side you are saying that he is like most beautified figure. So how you are maintaining both kinds of identity and what does it say? And then you have like a lot of history in Bihar because the person in 1997, one person was playing the role of Choudhary on a stage when this whole like Maoist movement and Ranveer Sena things was happening. Then Choudhary, the person who was playing the role of Choudhary, got shot dead on a stage. So you can understand that kinds of like a figure who is able to mobilize both sides, one not only the caste side but also the caste who does not like this figure. So so grotesque figure is important in terms of binding the community together. Like you try to create some kinds of spaces for healing, to reconcile your own kinds of psychic kinds of psychic kinds of threat and things like that, and therefore grotesque figure is still able to give you some kinds of response. You want beautified figure because that becomes the mode of representations, public representation, because if you're going to maintain that my deity is grotesque, ugly, then people say that yeah, you are coming from Dalit communities and that is very much expected. So now in that domain you want to say that no, my deity is equal like you, and that is very much working there as a resistance. But when you are coming to your home space, then you are still trying to maintain different kinds of bond that is working in a ritual space, but in theatricalized representation that becomes very different kinds of configuration. And this has been a kinds of threads through which I was trying to make some kinds of connection with history and other connection. I think you are historians. If people are going to become historian, so you can make those connections, and I leave you here. Thank you.
Your topic, your explanation reminds me of Michael Foucault's method of critical genealogies and Joseph Reach's genealogy of performance. Prakash offered a very critical nostalgia. This is a term that we normally use. Critical nostalgia. Yeah. Critical nostalgia as a method of scholarly inquiry and as an active practice of personal and cultural memory, as a tool for representing memorial of past homes and as a demonstration also of aesthetic. Theorizing the personality of the corporeal body of Choudhary within nostalgic appeals of home, homeland and community, Professor Brahm Prakash attends to the relations between origin, roots and identity. And he has also explored the performative possibilities of nostalgia relating to affective bodily experience and in relation to narratives in history. Thank you very much. And now I move to Dr. Benil Biswas, and he's going to speak on the utility of critical nostalgia again for creating aesthetic performances, and he's talking about the Dalit communities of Bengal or nostalgic memory. He talks about Dalit communities, how they negotiate the space between past, home, and present reality. So this is
and JDMC, and it's some kind of a déjà vu that I have at this particular conference from the kind of deliberations that we had at Jawaharlal University, and it's particularly very different and difficult to make sense at the end of such erudite presentations with the keynote and the two presentations here, and also to hold the audience before lunch, those last 15 minutes. So it's also an embodiment of a memory that I'm trying to dissuade of. But here I am. I would like to begin with a question that may appear deceptively simple, but carries deep methodological implication for historians and performance scholars alike. Where does history reside when communities have been systematically excluded from institutions that produce history. I think both our panelists have already foregrounded that kind of a possibility with the Choudhary community and the Banjaras here. And next slide, please. Next slide. For centuries, many marginalized communities in South Asia were denied access to literacy, temple authority, and elite system of cultural production. Their experiences were rarely recorded in archives, and when they appeared in historical records, they were often represented through a language of stigma, hierarchy, and administrative classification. Yet the absence of written records does not imply the absence of history, as we have already understood from our former speakers from the panel. Instead, history often survives in other forms, in songs, ritual performances, and embodied cultural practices, and through which communities transmit their collective experiences. Today, I want to reflect on the question through the performance repertoire of the Namashudra community of Bengal. Let's go to the next slide. And as the tradition, rather than words, maybe I would want you to have a feel of what a performance situation might be in the Namashudra repertoire. One form of such performance practice is called the Kobigan, and the poem goes like this: Gandhi morlo guli khaya, hai zinna yad mora, borno Hindu polay gelo, ei saral pollem dhora. Bujlen dadugon, bujlen didigon, Gandhi morlo guli khaya. This is a very important song in multiple performance repertoire because we are addressing budding historians here. This is a poem, anonymous, undated, but a very minute, sharp awareness as a historian would lead you know that probably the historical dating of the conception of this poetry might be between January 30th, 1948 and September 48. These were this interstitial period of the 6 months, which then bears a certain kind of presence in Namashudra memory. Next slide, please. But this poem is not just something which is about 47 or 48, but it is something which continues this day because after partition, a prolonged partition, the Namashudra community, which is a Dalit community, but in India, next slide, please, have continued to be on the margins of discourse. This is the demography of the Namashudras. We might know that they are from Bengal, but you could see that they are spread all over from the western, southern sectors. But the problem is that even with affirmative action of the under Indian constitution, Namashudras are scheduled caste or only in Bengal. In Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, they are not even part of the affirmative program. So they are in perpetual exile. The constitution also have rendered them Dalits in contemporary, like perpetual extermination. So, next slide, please. My argument is that Namashudra performance tradition functions as embodied archive, preserving histories of caste, migration, spiritual transformation, community assertion. At the same time, examining this tradition forces us to confront a number of methodological difficulties in historiography. Difficulties that become particularly visible when scholars attempt to write histories of marginalized communities. Next slide, please. So, Namashudras constitute one of the largest Dalit communities in Bengal. Historically, they are classified as Chandals, as we saw in the poem at the very beginning of the piece. And they have been represented in Brahminical texts, colonial ethnographic archives. This designation located them at the margins of caste society and justified their exclusion from many aspects of social life. Later, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, next slide, please. Witness powerful movements of social reform and self-assertion within the community. And whenever we try and think about, and this assertion led to a moment when we think about Dalit discourse in India, we readily engage with the next slide, the figure of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And as historians, we all know, but many might not be aware, that his engagement with the Constituent Assembly was due to Namashudra community from Bengal. Next slide, please, is the figure of Jogendranath Mondal, a Namashudra leader, who elects Ambedkar into the Constituent Assembly. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the interaction between Ambedkar and Jugannath Matul. The question is then, how such a community which has been so sharp in caste assertion, how most of us don't even know about it. There is late 2000s when EPW publishes article, is there caste in Bengal? As if the caste discourse in and around the country is so sharp, but Bengal doesn't seem to have any caste. So that's the kind of problem that we are addressing here. Next slide, please. A quick rumination would be, the key figures in this transformation that way is the space of contestation that in post-India's independence, Namashudra community is trying to get back to that assertion. One of the key figures is Harichandra Thakur, whose teaching emphasized spiritual equality, rejection of caste hierarchy. His ideas were later institutionalized by, next slide, Guru Chand Thakur, which led to emergence of Matua movement, but also situations of education among the community, which led to the figures like Jugannath Mandal and others. There was a assertion. Next slide, please. And these are the larger tenets. The Matua movement was not simply a religious revival, it was also a social, cultural movement that provided the Namashudra community with new form of collective identity. Crucially, performance played a central role in this process. Devotional songs, narrative performances, communal gathering become powerful medium through which teachings of Harichand, Guruchand circulated within the community and articulate certain kind of historical experience. Next slide, please. Next slide. So one of the prominent performance repertoire would be Motua Matam Kirtan, a devotional musical tradition, as you could see, where it's a space where all possible manifestations of genders are included. They all perform together. It's not just about an exclusive public sphere which is meant for men. In the images of Harichand and Guruchand, you also found that Harichand is always imagined with her wife, his wife. So it's also that kind of a manifestation. It's about a certain engagement. These performances are typically organized as collective gatherings where singers lead devotional songs and audience participate through call and response pattern, rhythmic clapping and bodily movement. What is striking about these gatherings is that a distinction between performer and audience is often blurred. The performance becomes a shared act of collective participation, and the songs themselves become frequent theme of social suffering, spiritual redemption, and communal solidarity. Next slide, please. This is one of the processions, as you could see, which is in the border areas near Bongao. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is one such kirtan. You could read the translation down here. I would read the final two lines. Iha chhara joto shob kriya bhrashta kukurer prasad pele khai. So we are equal to the dogs even. There's no discrimination between human beings and dogs. Bedo bidhi shouchahar nahi manitai. Therefore, we do not accept the rituals, practices as indoctrinated by the Vedas. So, and these are ideas which get circulated among the people. Next slide, please. This is the space where the congregation happens every year. Well, the movement began in Bangladesh, but after partition, these individuals can't get back to Bangladesh. So they would congregate at this place. The yellow line is the India-Bangladesh border. Next slide, please. And that's where the point, this marker, the exile, is marked by another leader called P.R. Thakur in the 1970s. Next slide, please. In this sense, the devotional repertoire functions not only as religious expression, but also as a narrative of social history. Another important element of Namashudra performance repertoire includes narrative song tradition, or the Kobigan. I was performing that at the very beginning, where performers recount episodes from the community history through musical storytelling in form of a poet's duel. Two poems would have a call and response, there'll be questions, and they would also ask audience, what are your questions? And they would try and provide an explanation to these modes. Next slide, please. And in such gatherings, we have, maybe this is one of certain songs that they are going to perform. You could read the translation here. The song goes like, Jodi hoye tar bhakto, buker taja rakto, Jodi hoye tar bhakto, buker taja rakto, শূদ্ররা ঢেলে দেয় ওরা কান্দিতে কোনোদিন, তবুও শোধ হবে না ঠাকুর গুরুচাঁদের ঋণ, তবুও শোধ হবে না। And the poems go further on to try and include Jogendranath Mondol, Ambedkar, and there'll be couplets where they're going to talk about তবুও শোধ হবে না বাবা সাহেব আম্বেদকরের ঋণ। Next slide, please. Another such line is this, Tader chok tuliya, which is also a mythical story from Manusmriti, but it would come down to try and tell them to regenerate a certain kind of assertion on their part. You could read the translation at the bottom. Tader chok tuliya neya hoto, jodi shudro bed korto darshan, ora kane ঢালতো গরম shisha, keo jodi korto শ্রবণ, ei phure or ba চীনের দর্শন, ছিঁড়ে আর বা চীনের দর্শন, করলেন শিক্ষাকে সর্বজনীন, তাই কোনোদিনও শোধ হবে না ঠাকুর গুরুচাঁদের ঋণ। Next slide. Through such performances, memories of caste oppression, social reform, collective struggle are transmitted across generations. Thus, performer occupies a complex role, not merely as entertainer, but as storytellers, historian, and cultural mediator, generating a certain kind of awareness. Next slide, please. Our chair and subsequently the earlier presentation has already spoken about these theoretical paradigms. I would not really reiterate, there are multiple other scholars, but it would be an invitation too, as I was thinking about this particular conference, that many of us as budding historians would also think of this particular conference itself also as performative iteration, to bring about not just talking about the past, but also about thinking how new modes of history writing can happen in future, so how you can carry it forward further. So thinking about Diana Taylor, I think there's a classic distinction that many of you might be introduced to between archive and repertoire. So canonical history writing engages with document, manuscripts, institutional record, and this particular conference wants to challenge that mode of historiography, extending it further into the realm of repertoire. And for communities whose histories have been rarely preserved in official archives, the repertoire becomes a crucial site for historical transformation. And our chairman has already spoken about Connaughton, there's Maurice Halbach, you could think about Mariana Hirsch and others who have all spoken about multiple ways of how memory operates and circulates in and around our spheres. Next slide, please. So what happens in this particular context, and there's some brief rumination and I'll close. The partition of India dramatically reshaped the lives of the Namashudra community. That is an erasure, which is also a certain kind of contestation, because the idea of dharma is also transforming with time, as Brahma Prakash has already reiterated. So Namashudra agency is not just about an anti-caste movement, but it's also about a contestation, how one fraction of the Namashudras would also want to, through this process of appropriation, gentrification, they would want to also assert a certain Brahminical lineage, where on the other side, there are groups who would want to engage with certain kind of a historicization of the process, that it is education which led to a certain kind of caste consciousness. So it is in this tension between the mythological existence, and which is not just about such communities, it is largely also about how the tribes exist at the peripheries of our society. There's some kind of an assimilation into a large grand narrative. The dominant mode of history writing is trying to appropriate them. Namashudras are also going through a similar kind of a contestation. Next slide, please. But with partition, migration disrupted established village networks, forced communities to reconstruct their cultural lives in unfamiliar environment. So what about individuals who don't really have histories or associated with stable archives? What about people who have already been rooted, don't really have a base? Like the moment you think about Banjaras, you could think about a very specific geopolitical location. But think about the Namashudras, they have to perpetually think about exile, not just spatially, but also discursively, they are not even scheduled caste. How do you write history of a community which doesn't even exist? Categories don't really talk about those communities. How do you think about it? But even in these circumstances, as you could see, they are displaced. But as you could read This is from one of my field trips to Dandakaranya, Gadchiroli, where there's a refugee settlement. And you could see, he's talking about he has moved to Dandakaranya, he has left everything. But how could he leave out a cultural artifact, which is the Kobigan? So it is a life engagement. On the left, you could see Ashim Shorkar, who's a very popular Kobian, who moves around the subcontinent performing these spaces. So these expressions. In these circumstances, performance tradition played an important role sustaining community identity, song and devotional gathering, allowed displaced community to recreate a sense of continuity with their past. Through these performances, memories of homeland, suffering, spiritual faith traveled across border. Performance therefore functioned as a portable archive, embodied, capable of carrying historical memory across geographical displacement. And with this, I bring it to a contemporary situation, thinking also about the conference, and with this I'll conclude. Next slide, please. So we have specific scholars, performance scholars like Dwight Conkergood, who has emphasized that performance can function as form of embodied knowledge, particularly within marginalized communities whose voices often get excluded from formal institutions. You have figures like Gopal Guru, Sharmila Rege, and others who have argued that marginalized narrative challenge dominant epistemologies by offering alternative ways of understanding social histories. When we view Namashudra performance repertoire through these lenses, it becomes clear that these traditions constitute a form of alternative historiography for them. They narrate histories of caste oppression, social reform, migration, resilience from within, and community itself. These narratives do not simply supplement written history, they challenge the authority of those archives and remobilize new notions of archives. Next slide, please. Which brings me to specific historical challenges that we have, and here to think about future scholars, all of us together, and I feel that most of us, through the sessions in the afternoon, are going to be a little more sensitive about these difficulties, the challenges that we have. The first challenge is archival absence. Marginalized community often appear sporadically in official archives, and when they do appear, they are frequently described through language of administrative control or social stigma. Caste is always a social science category. As a result, archive often reflects the perspective of those who governed rather than those who lived the history. Second challenge is of translation of embodied practices. How do we translate, put it into word? At the end of the day, history is all about writing. How do you do that? When scholars document performance tradition, they frequently convert embodied practices, songs, gesture, rhythms into textual descriptions. In this process, something essentially is inevitably lost. The affective intensity, the collective participation, the bodily experiences of performance cannot be fully captured on the page. Probably Hayden White was trying to push us towards these registers when he's moving beyond annals, chronicles, to a notion of narrativization in history. The third challenge is of interpretive authority. Writing about marginalized community always raises question, whose voice ultimately frames the narrative? Even the most empathetic scholarship must grapple with the possibility that academic interpretation may inadvertently produce the very hierarchies it seeks to create. There are again hierarchies that we create. The fourth challenge, and the final challenge, is probably epistemic hierarchy. Modern academic disciplines have historically privileged written knowledge over oral performative. Foucault mentions certain knowledges as subjugated knowledge. They are not even considered knowledge at all. Embodied and performative and embodied knowledge. As a result, traditions such as Motua Kirtan or Kobigan are often categorized as folklore, or cultural expressions rather than recognized as a legitimate form of historical narration. These challenges force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, perhaps the difficulty of writing histories of marginalized community. Perhaps the difficulty of writing histories of the marginalized community is not simply a problem of insufficient sources, Perhaps it reflects deeper assumptions about what counts as knowledge and who is authorized to produce it. I conclude with the last slide, please. Move further. The Namashudra case suggests that history does not disappear under such condition. Instead, it migrates into other forms. It survives in devotional songs sung collectively in village courtyards. It survives in ritual gathering where bodies move together in rhythmic remembrance. It survives a performance repertoire that carries memory across generation and across border. But recognizing this tradition also demands intellectual humility from scholars. If history can live in performance, then historian must learn to listen differently. We all must learn to listen differently. We must become attentive not only to documents, but also to voices, rhythms, gestures. Also, perhaps most importantly, we must acknowledge that marginal communities are not merely subjects of historical inquiry. They are themselves historians. Historians who write their past not with ink and paper, but with song, movement, collective memory. And it is in this contestation a narrative emerges. To study this tradition is therefore not simply to document culture, it is to confront the limits of our own historiographical practices and to ask whether our methods are capable of recognizing histories that has always existed outside archive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And
Thank you.
just to add, and no, it's over. But as a reckoning, and because we also had the Sufi performance in the morning, I would again want to end with two lines of our Kubigan repertoire. And this is also popular in Bengali imagination. Many of you might have heard. It's a poem by a 19th century poet called Idam Shah, which was used by Ritik Ghatak in Meghe Dhaka Tara, which is also an expression which is not just about that individual expression, but it then resounds and becomes some kind of a discursive framework for even the Namashudra community to think about their contemporary existence. And in the Kubigan tradition, I would just introduce the summary of the poem is, I want to cross this river, but I don't really know the name of the boatsperson who exists on the other side. Who will lead me on the other side of the river? How would I cross this river? So the river then is not just about a practical river, it is the discursive river. It is the river of how margins of histories are created and which becomes an expression for all of us. Maybe it is also an initiation into what would lead all of us as part of this conference to move towards. So the poem goes like this. Haimon kandiya kul hoilam bhava nodir pare mon tore keba par kore haire mon tore keba par kore माझी तोर नाम जानी ना माझी तोर नाम जानी ना আমি ডাইক দিমু কারে হে আমি ডাইক দিমু কারে হে মন তরে কেবা পার করে JDMC তোরে কেবা পার করে হিস্ট্রি অ্যাসোসিয়েশন আমাদের সবাইকে কেবা পার করে থ্যাংক ইউ
Thank you so much. Performances, especially songs of protest, as a site of cultural resilience is what he spoke about. And he says how they help to preserve and reclaim memories. They call these performances, to these songs of protest, and how these performances shape and reflect collective identities, especially for diasporic or suppressed cultures, and how they reclaim their spaces, and how these performances of resistance, and these select spaces become acts of memory and resistance, and how they help navigate loss, displacement, or cultural erasers, and they build counter memories. So this is what Benil was speaking about, and how they challenge dominant historical narratives and how memories in performance contribute to justice. So this is what I think, I hope I've summarized it properly, and how they preserve, they challenge memories, and how the embodied memories can be a form of resistance. Thank you so much, all the panelists, for really bringing out all the nuances. And I reassert, and it confirms my belief that history, there cannot be any, study of history without anthropology. Because anthropology is the study of man, as Malinowski had said. Anthropology is the study of man embracing woman. Rest is history. Thank you very much.
History Association. I extend our sincere thanks to our distinguished speakers, Professor Manisha Choudhary, Dr. Brahm Prakash Singh, and Dr. Benil Biswas for sharing their valuable insights with us. Our gratitude also goes to Dr. Kumkum Srivastava for chairing this session and guiding the discussion. I now request our Principal Ma'am and Teacher Convener, Dr. Tara Shima Ma'am, to kindly felicitate our speakers and esteemed chair.
Thank you, JDMC. I didn't need to be felicitated. I'm part of this institution.
Always.
Embodied past. Thank you. In the present. In the present. Yes.
Manisha. We are all subjected to the photographer's decisions on when we can move.
Performances are gestures.
The state control.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
No, the chair should be in the center. Thank you.
Thank you. You made us perform. Thank you. One person, one camera can make all of us.